He had everything money could buy: a skyline office, a fleet of cars that purred like contented beasts, and a calendar that bowed to his name. He had built a company on certainty and metrics, on the assumption that with enough resources you could predict outcomes and neutralize risk. Then one rain-slicked night, everything that fit on a spreadsheet fell away. The twins arrived under bright hospital lights. Doctors spoke in a language both clinical and final: hypoxia at birth, neurological damage, paralysis. Paralyzed. The word recoiled in the house like a splinter. For a man who had solved problems with contracts and deals, the diagnosis was a thing he couldn't negotiate with. In the months that followed, specialists became regulars in the house. Reports arrived in binders, and the nursery was a stage for demonstrations of medical equipment. His wife moved like a ghost between consultations, one day fierce and lit with the determination of a parent, the next emptied out by sorrow. He threw himself into work, booking consultations with the best names in pediatric neurology and funding treatments that promised incremental hope. It felt right. Money is agency. But each new test returned him to the same hollow place: progress measured in fractions, and the quiet terror that neither money nor fame had prepared him to face. Home took on the smell of antiseptic. Staff shifted into new rhythms: therapists with clipboards, nurses on rotation. Quiet corners of the house, once private, were repurposed as treatment rooms. The laughter that had once threaded the halls grew rare, edged out by the beeping of machines and the low murmur of professionals discussing prognosis. Enter Aisha. She arrived as a housekeeper, quiet and efficient, with hands that moved like someone who had learned how to hold more than objects. People in the staff room mentioned her background vaguely. She had worked in a clinic back home. She was patient. She was good with children. The way the house sorted people into hierarchies made it easy to ignore her at first. That miscalculation lasted only until he saw her in the nursery. One night, returning from a late meeting he had used to escape the house, he paused outside the nursery door. The room was dim. A small lamp threw a pool of light over two bassinets. There, on a thin mat, Aisha knelt and hummed under her breath. She cradled a tiny hand and guided it with the gentleness of ritual. Her movements were deliberate and slow, a choreography of small, purposeful touches. She spoke to them in a language that was more song than instruction, and though he couldn't understand the words she used, something in the cadence felt like reassurance. He stood unmoving, watching for a long time. The city skyscrapers could wait. In that single room, a different kind of architecture, one built from patience and touch, was forming. He began to notice things he had missed before: how Aisha prepared their meals with attention to texture, how she modified toys so they could be grasped, how she timed light stretches with lullabies. Specialists wrote down numbers and ranges, but Aisha recorded minutes and motions in a small notebook only she seemed to read. She taught the staff to convert clinical exercises into play. She did not flaunt credentials or correct doctors. She simply translated hard medical instructions into a language the children could accept: taste, rhythm, laughter. Curiosity moved him. He asked the house manager about her. She used to work in a clinic, they said, with children. She knows rehab routines. That explanation should have satisfied his logical mind. Instead, it left a hunger. He wanted to know the texture of the person who had brought a different rhythm into the house. "What's your name?" he asked one evening, coming by the kitchen where she was folding napkins. "Aisha Ofori," she replied, the name as unadorned as the way she tied her apron. "I learned from my mother and from the clinic." Small steps," he repeated, as if committing the phrase to a ledger. The house went on. There were triumphs and setbacks. A new therapy might spark a week of improvement and then hit a plateau. Once, a promising treatment produced a regression so severe it sent the household into a kind of stunned panic. He convened experts, weighing probabilities and the reputational consequences of any decision. In the same house, Aisha sat with the twins and hummed stories into their ears while moving their limbs through exercises he'd read about in research journals. She did not rush grief or gloss over pain. She met it and then returned to work. "Grief is not a thing to avoid," she told him once when he came into the nursery with the frozen look of someone who had tried to engineer an outcome and failed. "We feel, then we begin again." It was not grand gestures that changed the course of things, but 1,000 small choices. She reimagined ordinary objects into therapy aids. A ribbon became a tracking target for eyes. A spoon became a grasping trainer. She found that when the twins associated movement with laughter or taste, their willingness to try increased. Therapists noted improvement in certain muscle responses. Charts ticked upward in slivers. He began to participate. At first, his attempts were clumsy, a handed toy that landed in the wrong place, an exercise done without rhythm. Aisha corrected him gently, placing his hands the way a teacher might place the hands of an apprentice. Hold her wrist so, she'd instruct, or count with your voice. He learned to be present during the sessions, to mute his phone, to trade quarterly targets for bedtime rituals. His wife, watching him change, experienced her own complicated shift. She had wanted to fight the illness with every resource the world could offer. She had also felt abandoned by the results. Seeing him learn the patient craft of staying, of refusing to be defined by control, softened something between them. They argued less about what treatments to try and more about how to share the small daily victories. A turning point arrived on a spring morning. Aisha had spent weeks coaxing the twins into more deliberate reach exercises. She made a carousel of household items and placed it just out of reach. The older twin, who had always been slightly more reactive, returned focused to a bright ribbon. For a long breath, he reached with a trembling hand. The ribbon slipped into his palm. His fingers closed around it. The room exhaled. Staff, parents, even the cleaning crew who happened to be nearby. It was a small motion, but it carried a geography of significance that charts could not capture. He stood at the doorway, fighting the sudden tightness in his throat. In his life, meaningful results had generally been announced with press statements and presentations. This one needed no audience. It needed only silence and the soft applause of presence. He spoke to Aisha afterward, wanting to understand how the steady accumulation of care registered as progress. She told him about her first job in a clinic where families couldn't afford regular treatments. "We learned to make time our medicine," she said. "We learned that repetition with love is different from repetition with indifference." There were moments of friction. Some staff resented the attention Aisha earned. A few doctors suggested that her methods were anecdotal and unrepeatable beyond this house. The billionaire found himself defending her in meetings with tone-deaf specialists. He also found himself making structural changes, funding for a better home therapy space, hiring a pediatric physiotherapist she recommended, and allocating resources for continuous care rather than one-off expensive procedures. He set up a small foundation in the twins' name to support adaptive therapies for children who could not afford private care. He insisted the foundation spotlight the caregivers, the therapists, maids, and nurses, who often did the unnoticed work. Media asked for statements. He refused photo ops and arresting headlines. He wanted the story to be about endurance, not spectacle. One evening, months into their slow progress, he found Aisha teaching the twins to use a simple communication board. It was a homemade grid of symbols: food, light, play, laminated and worn. She taught the twins to point to the symbol to make a choice. Watching them select music and then watching their faces light up as their favorite tune played was as close to triumph as any acquisition he'd ever signed. He went to her then, feeling awkward in a way money never made him. "You saved them," he said impulsively. She looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that was both weary and fierce. "Saved? No," she replied. "I stayed. They taught me patience, and we taught each other how to keep going." That humility unsettled him in the best way. He promoted her, not as charity, but because competence should be honored. He gave her formal responsibility for the twins' daily care and a role in the foundation's decisions. But more importantly, he learned to step down from the pedestal of provider and step into being a presence. He wanted to understand where Aisha's steadiness had been forged. He arranged a quick trip to her village, Red Earth, mango trees, a small clinic that ran on faith and goodwill. He met her mother, a woman whose hands were scarred from years of nursing newborns and whose eyes held a steady softness. She told him of nights lit by kerosene lamps, of a young Aisha learning to soothe frightened babies with lullabies and steady strokes when medicine was scarce. The visit changed him. He quietly funded improvements for that clinic, better equipment, training for staff, and a modest transportation fund so families could reach therapy appointments. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It was an attempt to close a loop. Back home, He tightened budgets at the edges, but opened his life where it mattered. When he returned, the twins greeted him in the garden. Aisha had left a note on the kitchen table that read simply, "Welcome back." That small word felt like a compass. It reminded him of why he had begun this journey: to be present, to choose the slow work of care over the fast comfort of purchase. He spent his days differently. Time did not produce miracles overnight. There were days of no visible progress, and then there were days where a new sound or a firmer grip felt like a new continent discovered. The twins moved from passive recipients of therapy to participants in their own lives. With braces and adaptive chairs, they learned to sit more steadily. With practice and laughter as medicine, they began to explore language in halting but joyful fragments. Years later, when the twins could shuffle and take tentative steps with support, he often recalled the early nights in the nursery. He remembered the precise clarity of the first time he saw Aisha's hands coax emotion into being. He remembered his own resistance to anything he could not engineer. He had been a man who solved problems by rearranging resources. She taught him to solve them by rearranging his heart. On a bright morning in spring, he watched the twins race a small wagon down the garden path, Aisha laughing as she chased after them. Neighbors came out to admire the sight. He walked down the steps, joined the scatter of small bodies, and took a child's hand. "Thank you," he said to Aisha, not because his money had done the saving, but because her constancy had made change possible. She patted the napkin she had tucked in her pocket and said, with the simple dignity that had become her signature, "You used what you had. So did we. We did it together." In the end, he learned a truth his balance sheets could not show: that care is not a commodity to be purchased and shelved, but a practice to be lived. The richest thing he gained was not a return on investment, but a transformation of priorities. Presence had become his most valuable currency, and he spent it gladly.